Hey guys, Tony Rowe here, doing something a little bit different. Not a rapid game on Lead Chess, but another practical endings video. And I've been promising this one for maybe a week or so, and I just finished watching the Finn stream, and now it's almost past midnight actually, Tony time, and so what better way to lull myself to sleep than teaching the bishop and knight mate? So here we are. And first things first, this will be filed under the practical endgame series, but whether or not you find this to be a practical endgame is really up for debate. I will say that even though perhaps this ending maybe doesn't show up in a ton of games, I do think it's just a useful exercise in understanding the functions of the piece and piece coordination in the endgame, and simple endgame principles like king activity and all of that kind of stuff. And I also just think it's a good piece of chess culture for people to know. And so if you don't know how to mate with a bishop and a knight, I think this video will be a very solid start. With a little practice, I think no doubt everyone can learn this mate and do it, even though it's a long sequence. There are notable examples of masters failing to convert this mate, and I think it's less a function of ability and more a function of them not studying it. And one thing about this video is that the way I'm going to be presenting the bishop and the knight mate is a little bit different than the way most textbooks, let's say, would show it. So this mate is in a lot of different endgame books. The Mueller Fundamental Chess Endings, De La Via's 100 Chess Games You Must Know or You Should Know, both fantastic endgame books. Even Pandolfini's little endgame book shows this mate, and they all show what most people call the W method. And you can look that up. I'll find a link to the W method somewhere if you'd rather do that. But I'm going to be teaching Delatang's triangles. And I like this method a little bit better. I will say maybe it's just because that's the way I learned it and that's the way I've been successful when practicing this mate. But also, the W mate requires you to memorize sort of a weird and long sequence that has some side variations, etc. And Delatang's triangles, while being a longer sequence to execute, does not require precise memorization of long lines. So it's very much a process and a sequence, and if you memorize the three sort of triangle tabias, and it's not that hard to memorize them because there are only 4 pieces on the board at any given time, then you should be able to execute this mate relatively easily. So first off, what I mean by Delatang's triangles is that you're going to essentially use the bishop, in this case it's a light squared bishop, to cut a triangle across the board. And this would be the biggest triangle, which makes a triangle like so. And you're going to use the king and the knight to fill in the gaps. And yes, it is possible to fill in all the gaps here. And then once you confine the opponent's king to this triangle, then you will, in succession, confine the opponent to this triangle, again using the bishop along this hypotenuse, and using the knight and the king to fill in the gaps here. And then finally, there's a final triangle, which is exceptionally small, in which we'll confine the king to just these 2 squares, essentially. And of course, once you confine the king to these 2 squares, it's fairly easy to deliver mate. If you're not at all familiar with the knight and bishop mate, the first thing to note is that you can only mate the king on the corner square on the color of your bishop. So in this case, white has a light squared bishop. Mating black on these squares is going to be impossible, and only these squares are the ones you can mate on. And of course, it has to be a corner. It can't be anything else. And so generally the usual defensive strategy for black is to walk the king as far into the center as he can go, because black knows he needs to be in a corner. And then when white coordinates his pieces and brings his own king to the center and his pieces to the center, then black will, when forced, go to the wrong color, and then you have to force black's king in a death march all the way across the board to A8 or H1. And so the first part of our sequence will involve king activation, forcing black over here, and then into this triangle first. So once the black king goes from here to here, once you get him to about here, triangle 1 is entered, and then it's very easy to transition to this triangle, then this triangle, and the mate. And I think that I'm going to teach this a little bit wonky, perhaps. We're going to start kind of backwards. So first, the typical mating positions. This is the first one. So the king will either be mated on B8 or A8, and I'm just showing you the typical patterns of pieces. So when the king is on A8, of course, the checkmate is delivered by the bishop, and the king guards this square, and the knight guards this square. There is a second version of this, which I'll show you, that's more typical in the Delatang's triangles, which is, wow, why did that happen? There we go. That's like this. So usually, since our final triangle has the bishop on this diagonal, usually the bishop comes to B7, and as we'll see later, our knight is usually on the D5 square in this final triangle, guarding B6 and C7, so covering all of these squares to complete the triangle. So in this case, normally the bishop comes to B7, and the knight comes to D7 from F6. And this is the most typical mating pattern, and along with the one with the mate on B8, it's completely identical, of course, except for the fact that the king's on B8. So it really just depends on what square black's king starts on when you start this mating sequence. It's not really all that relevant. So we're going to work a little bit backwards here, I think. So the first triangle that we're going to look at is actually the third triangle, or the last triangle. And that triangle, the stereotypical position looks like this. So the easiest way to sort of, I think, remember the triangles is just remembering that the bishop is always on one of these diagonals. So we know that the king has to be on a light square, and so all of these triangles will confine the black king further and further in the direction of this A8 square. And so in the final triangle, our bishop can really be on any of these three squares. But in practice, it's really only essentially A8 or A6 rather, or C8 until we mate with the bishop. And you'll notice that our knight is actually not needed at all for the restriction of the king, which gives us the freedom to maneuver it into the mate square D7. The king itself, the king and bishop by itself, completely cut off the king, and black's king is just confined to walking back and forth on these squares until we deliver the mate. So once we lock up the third triangle, it's relatively easy to mate. For instance, if it's white's move, which it looks like it is, we play knight d7. Note that you do not play bishop b7 here. That's a stalemate, which would be a shame. You play knight f6, king a8, bishop b7, king b8, and then knight d7 mate. And that's essentially really all there is to this triangle. The last triangle is very easy. And mating from the last triangle is also very easy. The key is getting to the last triangle. So we'll move on a little bit to the second triangle. So this is moving outward a bit. And we'll of course put these all together in the correct order when we get there. Oh, and watch this. Look at this. Look at this genius preparation I did. Watch this. Bam, third triangle. Making use of that hideous black space that I'm too lazy to get rid of. So yeah, just again, really, once we learn how to maneuver from the triangles, the only thing you really need to know is where all of these pieces should be. So I put these here to kind of subliminally remind you where all the piece locations should be. Okay, so the second triangle. Of course, our bishop is one diagonal back, and our knight is still on d5. So we can see pretty easily how this restriction works. Black's king is confined to a slightly larger area this time, but not at all sizable. And again, if we look at this, maybe I'll highlight these things again. I'm arbitrarily picking different colors. I don't know why. It's sort of clear that if we don't do anything, if we don't use our king, then black's king will hover between these two squares. So in order to switch the bishop to the third triangle, we're going to have to force black's king into one of these squares, essentially, so we can free up the bishop to move. So given that black's king can walk to these two squares, we're going to have to bring our king all the way over here and stop him from doing that, and essentially budge him back with our king to one of these squares, and then, you know, more typically these squares, and then we'll switch the bishop to the final triangle. And bam, second triangle. I'm so amused by myself. Okay, and then the last triangle, and we'll see, of course, how these all fit together in a second. So this is the last triangle, and honestly, what a massive triumph of piece coordination here. So you have the bishop covering these squares, the knight covering these squares, and then the king covering these squares, which, okay, if I highlight these like a normal human being instead of an idiot, completely covers the king and confines it to, yeah, I mean, a large area, all of these squares, but pretty amazing, honestly, and one of the things I really love about this method, actually. And again, we see that unless we start budging the black king with our king in sort of a classic king and pawn opposition style fashion, black will just shuffle the king in some of these squares, and we won't make much progress. So again, our strategy is really going to be about, once we have a king confined to the triangle, using our king to budge him into squares into the next triangle, and then we'll switch the bishop. And one thing you note about this triangle is that while all of the other triangles have had the knight on d5, so the second and third triangle, we can see back over here that all of these have the knight on d5. At some point, we have to switch this knight to d5, and we'll see how that works when I get to the typical game. So, okay, let's go back to the starting position now, and we're going to walk through normal ways. I hope this is an effective teaching method, going backwards and forwards. Okay, so from here, we all know the rules of the game. We have 50 moves to mate this guy, or he's going to claim a draw. So via the 50 move rule. So we have our challenge laid out, and again, our first objective is to get the king out of the center and then back to presumably the h8 square, and then we'll walk him over here. And of course, the only way you can get this king out of the center and force him to walk back to the h8 square is if we activate all of our pieces. So something like, not that, something like this. And really, you can't get the king to h8 unless your king gets active and essentially makes it to f6. So unless you put your king on f6, black's king will always hover on some square like this. And so it's fairly easy to do so, but it's important to know that your king needs to end up on f6. Another thing to notice, if you look at triangle number 1, which I will add now, our bishop needs to be on this diagonal, generally. So in this position, it's going to be really easy for us to play bishop c4, but any of these squares are perfectly good squares and will suffice. Okay, so a typical sequence to start might be something like king e2, king e7, king e3, king e6, king e4, king f6. So black will stay as close to the center as humanly possible and will generally hover towards the h8 square when forced. And so I think now is a good time to play bishop c4, which also cuts off some nice central squares, so black no longer has access to these. And with the king, we can already see that we're sort of shoving black in the general direction of, h8. And so after king g6, probably something like king e5 is adequate. So we want to typically lead with the king and advance with the king. And black will likely play something like king g7. And notice that he's starting to get forced to h8. And I think probably the most accurate move here is king f5. Just, again, taking away a bunch of squares, and it's starting to look like, let's say, after king h6, we can play knight f3, king g7, knight e5, and again, a lot of these squares are sort of vaporizing, and black probably will play king h8 here. We'll talk about king h6 in a second, but this is kind of the position that you're looking for. So you want your bishop on this diagonal, you want your king on e5 or f5 typically, ready to hop into f6, and you want to bring your knight up. And eventually, given that we control all of these squares, black will sort of have to decide on whether or not he wants to give up f6 and go this way or go this way. And usually people are smart enough to go this way because it's a little bit... people know to go into the bad corner, essentially. So for the sake of this video, I'll play king h8 first, but we will talk briefly about king h6 towards the end. And now we get our king to f6. And black has been forced to the edge of the board, and we've gained a lot of territory. So this is sort of like step one. And the easiest way to think about that is that we want to essentially... we know that black's going to go to the bad corner. And so if you want to think about this sort of in a geometric fashion, you want to walk your king up diagonally to the bad corner and then just head towards that corner. So, for instance, if we had a dark squared bishop instead, like let's say we started with this position, black would intuitively head to this corner because it's the bad corner. And in that case, we would want to walk our king up to d5 diagonally and then head into the c6 square and confine black's king first to a8, and then we'd start the march over this way. So we'll go back. So we've gotten to here. This is kind of step number one. Now, you'll notice that the bad corner is the bad corner for us for a specific reason. Our bishop does not control that square, and so the only real way you can budge black's king from h8 is to use the knight. And in this case, we're going to do that with knight f7. We could play knight g6, and that's fine, but you can... I think either one works, but we'll just go knight f7 for the sake of brevity here. So knight f7 check. Oh, it's black's turn. King h7, let's say. And now this is kind of an important moment, and it illustrates a key concept in this endgame. In all of these triangles you see on the left, our bishop is on a specific square, but really any square on these triangles is sufficient. So if we have this large triangle set up, really any of these squares is sufficient. It's usual that in these endgames that the squares closest to the edge but off by one are the best squares for the bishop. So when we're in this triangle, we'd like to use this square or this square. When we're in this triangle, we'd like to use this square or this square. And when we're in this triangle, it doesn't matter. It's usually these squares. And the reason we do that is because these are typically squares that are out of the way for our king, but also still allow the switch to the next level. If we had our bishop here, it becomes hard to switch to this level. But my point is that in a lot of these endgames, because all of these squares are essentially interchangeable, we have waiting moves with the bishop, and we can lose a move. And in this case, it ends up being to our benefit that we can lose a move here. So, hold on, I want to make sure I have the right position here. Yeah, okay. King f5, king h6, knight f3, king g7, knight e5. So let's do this, just so I'm consistent with my notes. It doesn't much matter, so we reach this position instead. And okay, after knight f7 check, so we want to budge the king out of h8. This is our only way to budge the king out of h8, is to play knight f7 check. And after king h7, take a second and decide what you'd play here. Okay, so keeping my long digression in mind that I discussed before I screwed up the move order a little bit, white can go bishop d5, and it only leaves black one move, and that move is king g8, which does indeed step into a discovery, But the most important point is that black can no longer go to the h8 square. So again, take a second and decide what you'd play here as white. Remember, our goal is to start walking the king in this direction. Okay. King g6 is the move that I think is the easiest. And the point is that we take away the h7 square. Now h8, g7, h7 are all out of bounds. Black is forced to go here. And the next step has been reached in our mating pattern. We've forced the black king to step into the triangle. And so now we can essentially just walk our pieces back to this triangle position I have set up on the left with these orange circles. So after king g6, king f8, white has a lot of moves. Bishop b3, knight e5. We can just go knight e5, king e7, knight d3, king d6, bishop b3. And we have trapped black's king in the first triangle. And as you can see, we have like a little bit of a hole here that black can try to sneak out of, but we're going to meet king f7, king e7 rather, with king g7. And now we have the exact position in the first triangle set up. So, whoops, I always do that. So now black's king's completely locked in, and he's in the first triangle. So as we discussed already, the next step, as we know, because black is just going to shuffle between, all of these squares on the outer rim of the cage, we need to bring our king into the foray and start pushing the walls of this triangle back. Get black's king in, let's say, one of these types of squares, this region, such that we can switch the bishop and the knight into triangle number 2 right over here. So a typical continuation would be king g7. And I'm going to play the moves that kind of lengthen the process out as much as possible. King e8. And now I want you to think about what you would play. So obviously we know the goal is to force black's king away from these types of squares and get our king in. So how would you do that? Okay. Again, it comes down to the fact that all of these squares are essentially interchangeable. And there's a key concept here. So we can go bishop c4, king e7, and if you saw bishop f7, nice job. So we take away the e8 squares and all of these squares at the same time, and black's king is forced to regress a little bit. And this allows our king to budge in. So after bishop f7, black goes king d6, let's say. Again, staying sort of on the outer rim here, ready to pounce if white screws up in some way. And we get to go into king f8. So now we've taken away a couple squares, and black has to budge further. King d7. And again, we can use this zugzwang concept. Anytime black's king ends up in an optimal position to stop our king, we can just wait a move. So we go something like bishop b3. And after king d6, we go king e8. And you can see that it's starting to shrink already. So we had a triangle that sort of extended out to here, and now black's king is getting shuffled further and further into the center. And after king d6, king e8, black can go king c7, and we sort of gain the opposition again with king e7, king c6, we go king e6, and this is an important moment for black. So a very usual move would be king c7, and try and think of what you would do here as white. Okay. Again, we've moved black's king to the interior far enough that we can switch into the second triangle. So we could play bishop a4, exclam, and after king b6, king d6, king a5, bishop d7. Again, we stay sort of one square away from the edge so that we're ready to switch into the third triangle when necessary. We notice that black's king gets to the edge, but it doesn't actually do anything. He's sort of locked in anyway. He's got to head back, so king b6. And now that the king is not threatening to hop into b4, we can rearrange the knight with knight f4. And after king a5, we're just in time. Knight d5, and the knight guards the square again. And the king is locked in, and we've successfully transitioned into the second triangle. So that would be, this would be king c7 would be a minor inaccuracy for black. It's a little bit tougher if black goes king b5. It doesn't much matter. Once you learn how to sort of budge the king into the interior and transition to the triangle, the second triangle, it's really not relevant if black maybe makes us take one or two more moves to do so. So we'll just go king d6, king a5. Again, black hovers sort of in the periphery. King c5, king a6, and now bishop a4. So same thing. We budge the king away from these squares so that we can transition our bishop safely and we can get our knight over here, and then we transition to the second triangle. Note that I did not put my king on d5. I'm going to want that square for my knight, so I put my king on c5. Even though c5 makes more sense because we're cutting off these squares, it's just a generally good idea to think about leaving the d5 square free for your king at all times in this ending. Okay, so after king c5, king a6, bishop a4, we've reached the second triangle, essentially. We know what's coming next, hopefully by now. So after king b7, knight f4, king c8, knight d5, king d8, king d6. So black's king gets cut off at the pass here, has to go back to c8. King e7. So we know that if left alone, black's king will hover, so we're forcing his king back towards this direction with our king. The knight covers all these squares, and so we have sort of the freedom now. We can see that without the king, without the king, we have a perfectly functional triangle by itself. So we have the sort of degrees of freedom with our king to move black's king towards the interior again. So after king e7, king b7, we don't really have to let black's king... Wow, I'm making an absolute mess with these arrows. We don't have to let black's king into this square. We can go bishop b5, shortening up the cage a little bit. Bishop b5, king a7. So remember, we're looking for kind of this move soon. King d7, king b7. Let's go king d6, king b7, king d7, maintaining the opposition. King a7, king c7, king a8, and now bishop a6. And we can see we're now in the third triangle. And we've been here before, and this is child's play at this point. Note that compared to our diagram, our king is off, so if we want to, let's say after king a7, bishop c8, king a8, we can take a little bit longer and play king b6, king b8, bishop a6, and then we're in the exact same positions as this bottom diagram. It's not strictly necessary, though, so after bishop a6, king a7, bishop c8, king a8, there's a quicker mate. Take a second, actually, and see if you can find it. So it's a mate in 3. Okay, yeah, there's a mate in 3 here, starting with knight c3. And after king a7, knight b5, king a8, bishop b7 is made. So a little bit different of a pattern than I showed at the beginning, but essentially the same. But again, just for simplicity's sake, if you memorize these pieces, so you know you need bishop on a6, knight on d5, king on b6, you can just set up that position at will. It doesn't much matter. So you can go king b6 here, king b8, bishop a6, and you reach the final triangle. And you just play knight f6, king b8, knight d7, king a8, bishop b7 mate. And that's it. I mean, that's really all there is to it. The key to this ending is to understand sort of the general steps and understand the piece setups for the triangles. So to review them really quick and review the general steps, first we essentially get our king to the e5 square, put our bishop on this diagonal, pointing essentially towards the direction of this bad corner for us, and then we sort of remove these squares from black's king until he's forced to cede the f6 square, which will essentially force black's king to h8. And after that, we use our knight, typically on f7, to budge the king out of this h8 square. It's the only way to do so. And again, we just take away these corner squares and start budging them this way. And the moment the king steps to f8, we set up the first triangle. And we know the first triangle is, in this case, with the king needing to go to this square and with the king starting on this square, is these two squares. Probably the easiest way to remember it is to think about the mating square. So the mating square is, in this case, on a8. We know the bishop is going to be on a light square that's sort of almost linearly next to this mating square. So if we were mating here instead, the bishop would come to the g6 square, and we know the knight is 2 squares away from it towards the center. So we go bishop b3 in this case, and after king e7, knight e5, king d6, knight d3. And if the king were here instead, remember the bishop would go here and the knight would go here. So that's the first triangle set up. And then, again, once you have the triangle set up, the key is to just use your king to budge in. And once we get the king to a square, usually some square like this, these two squares, maybe this square. Once we get the king to these squares, we switch to the next triangle. And the next triangle is really easy to remember. You just move up both of these squares 2 ranks. So they're always on light squares, and that makes a lot of sense when you logically think about it. The bishop is always on a light square no matter what, and the knight needs to be on a light square to control dark squares. And the knight needs to always control dark squares because the bishop controls light squares very well. So we always see the knight and king filling in the dark squares that the bishop doesn't cover in the triangle. And another thing to think about is that the knight's pattern is always very consistent in the triangle. So however you get it to this d3 square, in this case, when we need to mate on a8, the knight goes to d3, and then the pattern is almost always this. So even though I'm not teaching the W method, I sort of am teaching the W method. The knight goes to d3, and then the only moves it makes are to set up the next triangle, which we need to make these sets of moves, and then to finally mate the king. So again, we use our king, and we use pass moves with the bishop to budge our king in. And once we force the king to one of these kinds of squares, our bishop comes in. And then our knight makes the trip to finish off this triangle. So we're in the second triangle. Again, our king goes to where it's needed to start cutting off squares, start pushing its way in. King pushes its way in, and we get the third triangle. So again, the knight, once it hits d5, essentially doesn't budge until it delivers mate. So really, this method almost boils down to setting up the first triangle, using our king to enforce the bishop on the second triangle. We budge the knight to d5, and then we budge the knight to a mate, and that's it. So I hope that's clear. I hope that this gives you guys the confidence to practice. If you want to practice this, in fact, you can go to board editor, and you can very easily clear the board and set it up. So you can set it up with opposite colors even, and just continue from here. And when you continue from here, you can play against Stockfish all you want at any time control you want. I would love to hear about you guys successfully executing this. I think if you practice it, hop onto lead chess, practice it against Stockfish a couple times. Go slow, play for accuracy. Don't try and blitz it out, especially your first couple times. Draw arrows, highlight the squares if you need to. Make sure you understand all the little tricks. Setting up the first triangle. Setting up the second triangle. Let's put this back on this square so it's not confusing. Setting up the first triangle, setting up the second triangle, and then setting up the third triangle. And keeping the bishop on, usually for this triangle, these squares, for this triangle, these squares, and for, look how awesome I am with these colors, for this triangle, these squares. All of these little tricks, if we know the king is heading over here to this bad square, bring our king up here and then to here. Keep in mind all of those little guidelines. Bring our king up in here, bringing our bishop over here, and then budging the king, remember, from h8 with knight f7 check, etc. Yeah, give it a shot. Let me know what you think. Oh god, I forgot something. Okay, let's go back. Idiot. All right. We will just go back to the analysis board. You'll get an extremely quick refresher. Something like this, like here, like here, like here. King h6, let's say. Oops. Okay, so I did promise what happens after king h6, f6 if black does not head this way but heads this way instead. So black can go king h6, and when black goes king h6, actually the easiest thing to do is essentially play the same position, just reverse. So essentially force black to go to this square instead of this square. And the easiest way to do that, well, actually, you know what? Take a second, think about it. How would you do that if you had to do that? We know that if you play some move that doesn't do anything, black will just head back this way. So how might you force the king to start going this way? And also, when you're doing this, think about that if the king is going this way, what the first triangle looks like, where those pieces should go, and how you're going to force the king into that triangle. So take a second. Okay. Probably the easiest way to force the triangle, I don't know if this is the most specific, this is just the one that I have in my notes. Keep in mind that the triangle would be this now, and that the squares for your pieces would be bishop on b3. Remember, it's always sort of close to vertical with the mating square, and the knight on d3. And the easiest way to do that is probably bishop h7. So stopping the king from going back to h7, forcing the king to go this way, and also getting ready to set up the bishop on the right hypotenuse of the triangle. So after king h6, bishop g8, black has to go king h5, and then bishop h7. And essentially all we're going to do is ensure that the king is where it needs to be over here to stop black from getting out sort of in this general area, and we're going to put the bishop on this square and the knight on this square, probably, you know, somehow like this or somehow like this. So a typical continuation would be king h4, knight c6, king g4, king e5. We are racing, most importantly, over to squares like this with the king to ensure that black's king can't get out some way like that. King e5, king f3, and we can go, even knight d8 here I think is fine. King e3, knight e6, king d2, king d4, king c1, king c3. And we've successfully set up the triangle. So the bishop is not totally optimally placed. It doesn't cover a4, but it's not relevant given where black's king is. So we can see that the black king is locked in, and if we flip this, it looks identical to what we've already discussed. That's one of the only tricks with the triangle method, is you have to be a little bit careful with sort of rotating these positions in your mind. But yeah, that's essentially it. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I hope that it's clear. I would love any comments and criticisms. If you like this silly little, these visuals on the side, maybe I can incorporate those in some other videos somehow, in other endings videos. If you didn't like them, let me know. I would also love to see successful bishop and knight mates. So if you guys try this out and you hop onto Lichess, and from the board editor, you play against Stockfish or you play it against a friend, copy the PGN and paste it in the comments. That would rule. And tell me how many tries it took for you to get it. So go slow the first couple times. Maybe you might mess it up a little bit. You have 50 moves, and usually Delatang's triangles takes from about 35 moves to about 42 moves. And one of the nice things about the triangle is it's kind of forgiving. Once you're trapped in a triangle, it's pretty hard to let black's king out, and even if you're not super precise and you miss a bishop switch every now and then, or you're not you don't push black's king as efficiently as you could, it normally only costs you one move, so a move or two. So it takes a while. It takes a couple slips for you to really bungle it and succumb to the 50 move rule. So yeah, post your games. I'm sorry I'm rambling. I hope you guys liked it, and I will talk to you soon with something else. If you have any requests for material, by the way, let me know. I like making these instructional videos. They take a little bit longer, of course, but I think they're fun. They help out my chess. Hopefully they help out your chess. Okay, it's 12:45. It's Netflix time. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.